representation in Congress. And it also, I think, will call into question about a dozen or so existing majority minority districts, mostly in the South. Now, those districts, as you know, Major, have been a way for Democrats to pick up seats in some of those states, those red states in the South. So this ruling is a win, I think we can say, for Republicans. But legally, this is a Supreme Court that going back 20 years or more has been saying in case after case, a consistent line of cases, that the Constitution is colorblind. And that's why we've seen the Supreme Court do things like throw out affirmative action in college admissions. This line of cases very consistent with the court's ruling today. What about the midterms? I think this ruling coming today, 6 months after it was argued back in October, may come too late to have an impact on these upcoming midterm elections. I think the focus will be going forward, limiting states from considering race when they're trying to consciously and intentionally draw up districts to increase minority representation. That means, Major, that you might not have as many of those kind of ink-blocked states or states that have districts that zigzag like a Z, where they go from, like this one did, from Shreveport all the way down 250 miles to Baton Rouge, scooping up black voters along the way to, again, pick up voters to get enough black voters there to have that majority. So I think, you know, that will restrict some of those those districts for sure. Looking at this decision, it's 37 pages long. There is a dissent by liberal Justice Elena Kagan that appears to be longer than the majority, and it looks like a barn burner. She is saying that today's ruling will is gutting the Voting Rights Act and will call into peril some of the accomplishments that we've seen over that historic 1965 law that really dismantled Jim Crow and systemic barriers to voting for black people in the South. Of course, the Supreme Court today, as they have in recent decisions on voting rights, is saying the country has moved past that. It's time to stop intentionally focusing on race. And as Chief Justice John Roberts said in a case back in 2007, the way to end discrimination, race discrimination based on race, is to stop discriminating based on race. And this Supreme Court, with those 6 conservative justices, believes that racial preferences, whether it's in affirmative action, whether it's in redistricting, that can amount to unconstitutional race discrimination, Major.
Jan, I'm going to let you continue to read the opinion, and if there's anything else that strikes you, please let me know. In the meantime, I want to bring in Jessica Levinson, CBS News legal contributor and Loyola Law School professor. So this is Section 2, Jessica, of the Voting Rights Act. And then in 1982, Congress also passed an amendment to the Voting Rights Act, making it clear that some voters could, if they felt that the district lines were extremely discriminatory to their interests, bring legal action. So there's 2 aspects of congressional intent here, yet the Supreme Court said, we've taken that into consideration, but we still believe that process violates the Constitution, and the Voting Rights Act Section 2 has gone a bit too far.
That's exactly right. And I want to echo what Jan said, which is that this is a case where the Supreme Court, once again, a majority has said, don't use race. We've seen this when it comes to admissions in higher education. We've seen it in other circumstances. And here again, we have the court saying, in order to comply, in this case, with the Voting Rights Act, and you just mentioned Major Section 2, which prohibits diluting somebody's ability to vote on the basis of race and other categories. In this case, the court is saying the way to ensure that we can satisfy the Voting Rights Act is not to make these race-based lines. As Jan said, we have a serious division in the court in the sense that we have Justice Kagan saying that this is the incorrect interpretation of the Voting Rights Act. And then, in fact, when you think about this landmark piece of civil rights legislation, that one of the ways to ensure that you are complying with this legislation is to allow the use of race when you draw lines, when you draw these legislative lines. I think Jan was exactly right to point out this could have implications potentially not for the midterms, but certainly going forward, where you're going to see that states can draw these district lines, I think, using slightly different criteria and frankly being less worried about complying with Section 2, because I think that the big takeaway here is that it's going to be hard to bring successful challenges under Section 2, again, of that landmark civil rights legislation, the Voting Rights Act.
It's worth pointing out that Section 2, unlike other parts of the Voting Rights Act, were permanent and national in scope. Some elements of the Voting Rights Act, which are much more geographically specific to remedy past abuses in certain areas, Section 2 applied permanently and nationwide. That's why this is such an important ruling. I want to turn now to our chief White House correspondent, Nancy Cordes. Nancy, Jan referred to some of the potential political implications of this. Pick it up from there.
Sure. So I think that there is a concern or a question about whether this ruling is going to kick off Chapter 2, if you will, of the gerrymandering arms race that we've been watching play out across the country since last year, when President Trump first said that he thought that Texas should redraw its legislative maps. And the reason that that was controversial is because typically states only redraw their maps once every 10 years after census figures come out. We're right now in the middle of that cycle. But Texas said yes, and that kind of led to a cascade of other states, both controlled by Democrats and Republicans, saying they were going to do the same, looking for an advantage in the 2026 midterm elections. Now, those elections are just 6 months away at this point. And so it's really tight, very difficult to redraw maps in any particular state with enough time for them to survive any potential legal challenges and train poll workers and get ready for that election in November. But already, Major, Mississippi's governor has said, he just said on Friday, that he is going to call a special session of the legislature 21 days after this ruling comes down, and the clock starts now because the ruling has just been handed down, to take a look at Mississippi's maps and determine whether they should be redrawn. Right now, Mississippi has 4 congressional seats. 3 are controlled by Republicans. 1 is controlled by a Democrat. And ostensibly, the goal would be to redraw those maps in such a way that you would then have 4 Republican-controlled seats in a Republican-controlled state. So that's the kind of thing that we could now see play out in a handful of states like Mississippi, like Florida, that weren't really part of that first round of gerrymandering, where we saw states like California, Ohio, Utah, Missouri, all scramble to redraw their maps over the last 12 months. Virginia just had an election about that very issue last week. But now we could see a handful of new states try to tackle their maps based on this new ruling.
Nancy Cordes at the White House. I want to return to Jan Crawford in our Washington, D.C. newsroom. So what does this say about the future of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act? Because we have 2 tranches of congressional intent when the act was originally propounded and then when it was amended in 1982. And Jan, as you've often taught me, this court pays very close attention to congressional intent.
Well, this court is saying that I think we're going to need intentional race discrimination before we can bring some of those challenges, which would really kind of put the brakes on a lot of these redistricting efforts, which were designed around the idea that even if it wasn't intentional discrimination, it had a discriminatory impact. It was diluting the power of Black voters to elect candidates of their choice. Like, that would be enough. That's not going to be enough anymore. That's what this court is saying. But I think it's important to point out that the court could have gone a lot further. The state of Louisiana and other states like Alabama were arguing that they should just basically strike down Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. The court is not doing that. They're taking a kind of a more middle ground, but still, nonetheless, a very broad ruling that, even as Justice Thomas says in his concurrence, should largely put an end to this, quote, disastrous misadventure in voting rights jurisprudence. Justice Thomas being the voice, going back since he joined that court in the early 90s, calling for the court to rethink how it's doing these districts, saying that it divides people into silos based on their race. So it's broad enough for him in this case, Major.
Jan Crawford, thank you very much. To recap, 6-3 vote. The United States Supreme Court strikes down majority-minority district in Louisiana. The decision weakens some aspects of the Voting Rights Act. It is a win, broadly speaking, politically for Republicans. But it is probably coming too late to impact in any material sense the November midterm elections. Our coverage will continue on CBS News 24/7, your local news, and of course tonight on the CBS Evening News. This has been a CBS News Special Report. I'm Major Garrett. Good morning.
You've been watching a special report. The U.S. Supreme Court just issued a ruling in a major redistricting case. The justices struck down Louisiana's new map. Let's start with CBS News legal reporter Katrina Kaufman. Katrina, thank you so much for joining us. Break down this ruling.
So what the Supreme Court has decided is that this congressional map that was created in Louisiana to create a second black majority minority district is an unconstitutional racial gerrymander. I've been looking closely at the very strong dissent written by Justice Elena Kagan. It's actually, I think, even longer than the opinion itself. And she talks about how this is essentially eviscerating the Voting Rights Act, even though they don't outright overturn Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which was a concern that could be a consequence of this ruling. She said that basically, they are rendering it null. She talks about how the Voting Rights Act was born of the literal blood of Union soldiers and civil rights marchers. And she said that today's decision renders it all but a dead letter. So this could have a significant impact on minority representation in politics.
Stand by, Katrina. I want to bring in CBS News legal contributor and professor at Loyola Law School, Jessica Levinson, and we're also going to be joined at some point by Jan Crawford in Washington. But Jessica, let me begin with you. So how realistic is the court's demand that plaintiffs disentangle race from politics, given how closely those seem to overlap in American voting patterns?
Vlad, you've hit it. So this has always been difficult to try and say, how can we separate out politics and race when sometimes, frankly, we see race as a proxy for politics and vice versa. I think what we have here is a court saying something that it's consistently said for years when it comes to other cases in other areas. Let's think back, Vlad, to affirmative action, which is don't use race. So what we have in this case, when it comes to we're talking about drawing legislative district lines and what you can consider when you draw those lines, and specifically in this case, what you can consider when you draw those lines to comply with that landmark piece of civil rights legislation, the 1965 Voting Rights Act. The court is saying, do not consider race as a dominant factor. What does that mean? It means that if we go to court and we challenge lines, that what the state can say is, I wasn't considering race, I was considering politics. And I think that would be a very strong defense after this particular decision. Now, Vlad, I don't know that I'm answering your question because, frankly, I don't know that there is a true answer to how do you ever separate those two things completely versus what's going to happen in court moving forward. That I think I can't answer.
Well, that's the point that the dissent makes, right? The dissent is essentially saying that the majority is ignoring what are real world discrimination where race and politics are often intertwined, and it's very, very hard to separate. Even the notion that we say, as we report this, that this is now going to benefit Republicans, which would lead to the assumption that it's mostly white Americans who are in the Republican Party and not black Americans.
Well, that's right. So obviously we do have, it's not just assumptions, but we have data where you're looking at certain groups and certain minority groups, and you say this group tends to vote more for this party. Now, of course, we should be careful about this because, as we've seen for the last number of elections, some of those assumptions can change, and it depends on what's happening in the country. It depends on the candidate. But certainly it has been for years the case that if you look at a certain group, you say they tend to vote Republican. If you look at another group, you say they tend to vote for Democrats. What the court is saying here, what a majority of the court is saying is, you can consider things like political affiliation. You can consider the traditional factors that we use when we are drawing lines, but do not use race as the predominant factor. This feels very similar, Vlad, frankly, to the conversation we had after the affirmative action decision. You can consider other ways to make sure that you have this kind of college classes that you want, but don't consider race as a factor.
Let's turn now to CBS News chief legal correspondent Jan Crawford. So, Jan, the goal of this second district in Louisiana, which was majority black, was to create more representation in voting there. The Voting Rights Act prohibits any kind of racial discrimination in voting. How then is that district, based on this order, in violation of the Voting Rights Act?
They're saying that just because you say you have to redraw this district or draw this district under the Voting Rights Act, it doesn't mean that you can violate the Constitution. And I think that's kind of the big underpinnings of this decision. Obviously, this is kind of an interesting case because Louisiana initially just had one majority black district. A group of black voters sued. They took it to court and they won. And the court ordered the state of Louisiana to draw that second district to comply with the Voting Rights Act. Then what happens? Well, we're a litigious society. Another group of voters, mainly white voters, sued, saying that second district was a racial gerrymander because it too closely focused on race and the race of the voters, and that violates the Constitution. So that was the case that was before the court today, and that's when they struck down today that second legislative district as violating the Constitution. The argument was that complying with Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act was enough of a compelling interest to justify considering race that would otherwise be unconstitutional, and the justices rejected that argument today. They're going to make it much more difficult, I think, for legislatures now to really just focus on race and draw those. You showed the district earlier, these kind of districts that zigzag across the state, picking up black voters in completely different cities and potentially communities of interest to get that district that has enough black voters to make a majority. In the short term, I mean, there are 61, I believe, the last I checked, black representatives in Congress right now in the House, and 15, I think there are 15 now majority districts. So it's not going to have, a dramatic impact on representation. I think there's about lawyers on both sides that I've talked to. There's about 12 districts right now where you may see some challenges. But keep in mind, Republicans like these districts. They like majority black districts, too, because they like having, enough voters in their district where they're not as worried about getting reelected. So, it can kind of cut both ways. I don't think we should assume that all of these majority districts are going to be challenged now, or that it's going to have this huge dramatic impact on black representation going forward. The writing has been on the wall for this. There was an important case in 2024. If you look at what Texas did with its redistricting, they didn't even really mount serious Section 2 challenges. So, when you see states going forward talking about redistricting, like Florida, for example, trying to redo its map, it will make it easier. They won't probably have to worry about Section 2 as much, but I think already state officials knew that this is the way the court was headed because they had a big case in 2024 that signaled this was coming.
Yeah, it's so fascinating to me, Jan and Jessica and Katrina, about how the Supreme Court has operated historically over the years, because I wonder how the court, in this interpretation of what they're calling vote dilution under Section 2, has evolved over time. The case that is mentioned is Thronberg versus Gingles, which is only, for those of us who were around, in 1986, which was, again, a landmark case. A unanimous court found the legacy of official discrimination. And it seems like the court is walking that back now. Do I understand that correctly?
I think I think the court is certainly saying we need to think about the way things are today. And as Jessica was saying, that's really how they approach the affirmative action case. And Justice Kavanaugh has talked about that, too. Is there some kind of limit, temporal limit? I mean, we're not in 1965 anymore. We don't have poll taxes. The numbers, if you look about participation and representation, are now in many states, even in the Deep South, we've gotten some kind of parity there and equity there. So they're saying it's time for us to stop focusing on race, as the Chief Justice said, going back now almost 20 years. So, yes, I mean, I think that this is a change. Obviously, they're not overturning that case that you referred to, although the state of Louisiana and others had certainly suggested that they should. Justice Alito, in his opinion, is saying that they're kind of updating it. Now, Justice Kagan, in her dissent, is calling him out for that. But, This is a decision that is very much in a continuous line of cases with this court on voting rights and certainly on other race discrimination issues. And the focus is the Constitution is colorblind. And we need to stop focusing and drawing lines based on race. That's something that Justice Thomas has been saying since he joined the court. And that is something now there's a majority of justices who agree with him. And that's why you have seen not only the ruling today, but the ruling 3 years ago in the affirmative action case when the justices threw out affirmative action in college admissions. This is a court that is going to continue saying no to racial preferences, no to race considerations, and insisting that the Constitution is colorblind. The liberal justices obviously do not see it that way.
Really quickly, Jessica, before we go, so do you think that it's fair to say that the Voting Rights Act is being just narrowed by the court? They haven't struck it down. Or would you characterize these rulings as just clarifying the constitutional limits?
I think that entirely depends on your perspective. What the majority is saying here is we're clarifying what Congress could do when it passed the Voting Rights Act. So, Vlad, as you know, whenever the federal government acts, it has to point to part of the Constitution that gives it the power to do so. In this case, we're looking at the Constitution and we're looking at whether or not Congress had the power to say, under the Voting Rights Act, here's how you have to, for instance, draw district lines. What the court is saying is we want to clarify Congress would have exceeded its authority if it allowed for unconstitutional racial gerrymandering. And so I don't mean to try not to answer your question, Vlad, but I think this is entirely dependent on how you view the case and whether or not you think that the majority was correct or you're with the minority on this one.
Fascinating. Katrina Kaufman, Jessica Levinson, Jan Crawford. Always love a decision day with all three of you because I learned so much. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it. We got some other breaking news. The Senate Banking Committee, as expected, has advanced Kevin Warsh's nomination to become the next chairman of the Federal Reserve. Republican Senator Tom Tillis was originally a key no vote over the Justice Department's investigation into the current chair, Jerome Powell. But last week, the DOJ ended that probe, prompting the North Carolina lawmaker to drop his blocking. Warsh is expected to sail through the full Senate vote and be confirmed in time to take over for the Fed on May 15th, when Powell's term will end.
And we are also keeping an eye on Capitol Hill, where Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth is facing lawmakers for the first time since the war with Iran began. We'll bring you more from his testimony ahead. This is CBS News 24/7 Mornings, the #1 free streaming news service in America.
The only way to get a 360-degree understanding of America is to get out there in America. There really is no swing at all when it comes to the priorities of everyday people. We care about how secure our job is, whether we can plan on retiring with dignity, whether our kids can have a brighter future than we have today. These are the fundamentals of American life, and I think they can be again.
Why doesn't he tell Republicans, come into my office, let's hammer this thing out?
Margaret, it's a totally fair question.
Politics isn't a game. Why are you opposed